Well, welcome. I've got John Marshall uh, on today for this preacher conversation. Somebody must come preaching. And let me first of all ask John Marshall, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Uh, I wouldn't complain. I have a minimal amount of pain, but it's tolerable. So I'm thrilled.
All righty. Okay. Well, good, good. How are things in South Carolina today?
Well, we have a little overcast. I think we might be in 60s temperature-wise, and I think that's where we are. I actually have not been outside today, and, but it's overcast, and I think when I looked at the forecast, it said we would be somewhere in the 60s today, the low 60s, I believe.
All right. Well, you got your champion hoodie on. Did you do any jogging today or exercising?
No, I had planned to yesterday, and I ended up with a plumbing issue that kept me till about 8 o'clock last night to get it resolved. And this morning, I actually didn't feel good at all. Matter of fact, I started to cough and cancel this because my wife had been running 102 temperature.
Oh man.
So Saturday, matter of fact, she's taken off from work today. I think somewhere trying to doctor to her, I may have caught a glimpse of what she has. I hadn't told her that yet, but I took my temperature and it was up to where hers was.
Okay.
Decided I'll just go ahead and plow through it. It's not going to feel any better if I don't do something, so I might as well do
Well, we'll be praying for her, praying for you all.
something.
All
Now,
right.
that's a farmer mentality. You city guys may not know anything about that because if you don't get the corn planted, you don't eat.
Yeah.
Reason for not getting it planted don't help at all. So reasons don't help on the farm at all.
Well, you did make a point. I am a city guy, but okay.
Uh,
Well, let's get started. Who are you? Tell us about John Marshall? I guess I should say, what would you like the audience to know uh, who John Marshall is?
my daddy was 50 when I was born. My mother was 41, and I'm not the youngest child. My grandfather was 65 when my father was born. So I'm two generations from slavery. Not my great grandfather, but my grandfather was 16 when the slaves were free. So I have walked around in the marketplace in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where my grandfather was sold. Growing up on a farm, growing up with that background, gives you a perspective that may be different from some others. Grew up in a segregated school system, segregated communities, segregated restaurants, every place. I remember going in the back door, all of those kinds of things. But we never embraced a victim mindset at all. We simply decided that whatever it takes, uh, we will do that, and we will not only survive, we will thrive. So in my elementary school days, my high school days, matter of fact, in my elementary school, we had 6 classrooms and 8 grades. The principal taught the 8th grade class. So I had all kinds of deficiencies that could have justified lagging behind. But when I got to college, it quickly became evident that they had a head start, that they were not one step ahead of me at all. And so I subscribe to the philosophy that you don't even take time to discuss the things that are against you. You figure out what to do and go make it happen. From a farm background, there is no manual. You have to figure out how to get the cows in the barn. If you get stuck in the field, there is no record to come. You have to figure it out. So I grew up with that mindset. Whatever comes up, I figure it out, keep moving forward, never give a second thought to what went wrong.
So you say your dad was 50 and your mom was 41 when you were born.
Yeah,
Are you the youngest of siblings, or you have other siblings?
younger than I am.
Oh,
And my daddy died at home, no high blood pressure, no heart trouble, no cancer. Just slept away at age 92. My
hmm.
mother died at home, no high blood pressure, no cancer, no medication. She slept away at 101.
Wow.
So my mother went 32 years once without seeing a doctor. And she only went then because we told her, if you don't have some kind of medical chart, you can sit there, don't know where to start looking at. And so she went to the doctor at age 73, I believe it was. And the doctor told her to come back in 10 years. So she went back at age 83. So yeah, that's my background. Everybody would see my dad and they would say, I saw your granddad. I said, no, you didn't. You saw my dad.
That was your dad. Okay. All right.
Places with him. And
Uh-huh.
they would say, who you got there with you? Bobby, your grandson? And he would say, no, this is my son. And I would hear people say, yeah, right.
Right. Okay. All right.
People thought he was my grandfather.
So did I hear you say you were born in Fayetteville, North Carolina?
That's where my grandfather was sold at. And they took him to Hollis Springs, Mississippi, which is Marshall County, which may be where we got our family name from. I'm not sure. My mother is from Greensboro, North Carolina. My daddy grew up in Mississippi. He got out of the army in North Carolina and met my mother. And then they moved to Tennessee. And that's an interesting story. When my daddy went into the military, he was living in Mississippi. He had an altercation with a white doctor.
Mm.
And he had severely beat him senseless with a hammer. So the Masons hid him out until he could get out that next night, and we got him to Gary, Indiana, and he went into the army from up there. And that's why he would never move back to Mississippi. And so when we were growing up, I couldn't understand why my parents lived in Tennessee and we had no relatives, none. Why didn't you go to Mississippi? Why didn't you stay? But he got close to his relatives, but he was afraid to go back to Mississippi because you just never know what type of retaliation. But I had a half brother who was born and raised in Mississippi, and he told me the story. My daddy never told me that story, but he told me that he remembered the night that it happened. People came to the house looking for my daddy, offering them money to tell who he was, but the Masons, and I don't know whether it was black Masons or white Masons, but that's who hid him out. And when we were growing up, we would go to Mississippi. Uh, we would go on early Sunday morning. And before he would go, let's say if we were going to go to Mississippi the third Sunday in February, about 2 weeks early, my dad would get all of his guns, oil them up, have plenty of ammunition, put them in a cotton sack and put them up under the seat in the truck.
Mm.
Go to Mississippi early Sunday morning in time to get there to go to church. So we would go to church, go to a relative's house and eat dinner and get back on the road to get out.
Hmm.
So those kinds of experiences that people have read about, I've lived those.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for that reason, he would never call anybody and tell them he was coming.
Mm.
He was afraid that somebody might intercept the communication. I do think, though, that by the time we came along, that animosity had subsided, so he probably did not have a real reason to fear, but he never took a chance.
Okay. All right. Very interesting. You are an author. Had you thought about writing a book about your family history, or?
No, I have a cousin in Tupelo who is an attorney. Matter of fact, he was a civil rights attorney, Kenneth Mayfield. He was one of the most prominent attorneys in Tupelo. He wrote a book. It's entitled Growing Up Black in Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
How I became a civil rights lawyer. And I highly recommend people read that book. I actually told him that he should rename that book because the book really is about how family members work together to support each other. His father was killed in an accident, car accident, when he was probably 16 or 17. His mother did not work, and she had 7 boys and 1 girl. And his father did not believe in insurance. He made fun of people who had insurance. So you have a mother, his mother now is 91 years old. So you have a woman with 8 children and no source of income because she had never worked. So her parents and grandparents were the lifeblood. Now, I don't know whether you've heard of the Ole Miss 7. You ever heard of that?
No.
That's a group of 7 students who was thrown out of Ole Miss for protesting.
Mm.
It's called the Ole Miss 7, and he talks about them. I got Ole Miss 7 or Ole Miss 6, one of those.
Mm-hmm.
He was kicked out of Ole Miss for protesting. And it's interesting. There was a concert. So the black students had planned, rush the stage, take over the microphones, and shout their demands. And that's what they did. So the president put them out of school. So he went to Tougaloo College and graduated. All 7 of those students who was put out have succeeded extremely well professionally. As a matter of fact, one of those 7 students is on the board of trustees at Ole Miss.
Isn't that something?
And when my cousin's daughter graduated from Ole Miss, as a token of reconciliation, they allowed the black guy who was on the board of trustees, who was put out with my cousin, to give my cousin's daughter her diploma. So in the midst of the graduation, the black guy hands my cousin her diploma as a token of reconciliation.
Well, yeah. Well, a book is definitely needed. I'd like to read that book by your cousin, the attorney in Tupelo. So that's history. Let's move along. Tell the audience, for those who don't know you, in Churches of Christ, of course, we know you, but where are you serving now? And give us a little history. I don't think, did you tell us about your family? You've got children, grandchildren, and all of that?
4 children, 11 grandchildren, 4 bonus grandchildren, total of 15. My oldest son is in Jacksonville, Florida. The other 3 are in the Atlanta area. And all of them are professional. My baby son teaches math at Georgia State University. My daughter is an accountant. My oldest son is a HR specialist with Southeastern Groceries in Jacksonville, Florida. And my second son is a middle school principal. So he and my baby son and their mother are all educators.
Wonderful. Now tell us about where you're serving now as minister.
So come September, we planted a church in Anderson, South Carolina, the Graceview Church of Christ. Matter of fact, Paul Sanders and I came up to start it. We came up, we did not know anyone in Anderson, not a single soul. We came up, started walking around through the city, inviting people to a Bible study. And people said they would come. And we probably did that 3 or 4 weeks. We had enough people to start the class. And once we got ready to start the class, Paul's work schedule changed and he never ever was able to come. So we actually started a church, and we did not have anybody to preach. So we were doing 2 services in Stone Mountain. I would preach there at 8 o'clock and get somebody to preach for me at 11, and then I would drive to South Carolina and preach at 12. And then I would come up on Thursday and do the Bible study. We did that we did the Bible study for a year before we started a Sunday worship. And then after I started trying to preach in both places, Brian Jones, who is now the preacher at Newburgh, was on board. He had never preached. He had never thought about preaching, but he had become one of the best personal workers you've ever known, and he loved it. Brian was doing 2 and 3 home Bible studies a day, and he was just engulfed in it. And he said to me one time, and he said, "Man, if you need me to do anything in Anderson, let me know." Well, he had no idea what I was going to tell him. I said, "Man, I need somebody to preach." So for the whole year, I gave him a sermon, taught him how to preach it, and he would come up here and preach it. Mm-hmm. Incidentally, I think that is the best way to train a preacher. You give him a true theology. He learns sermon craftsmanship by looking at how you have crafted the sermon. And the only thing that he has to do is to concern himself with the delivery of it. I believe that that is the best way by far to train preachers. And I think if we did that, we could satisfy the preacher shortage within about 18 to 24 months. Brian Jones is some kind of preacher. And that's how I trained him.
Now, when did the Anderson Church start? What year was that?
We started the Bible study in 2010. We started the church meeting on Sunday in September 2011.
Okay, great. All right. So that's
Bible study has been going on right at 13 years. The church right at 12.
Good.
And we are a fully self-supporting church. We don't depend on any church for monthly finances.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Share with us what I call your come to Jesus conversion experience. How would you describe your come to Jesus conversion experience?
I grew up in the Baptist church, but I never went through the Baptist experience. So in my mind, I was not saved. And I had always said, I'm going to become a Christian when I get married. So I was in the process of moving close to getting married, and my wife was a member of the church, and her preacher asked to talk to me. So I went to his house in Memphis, and we sat in the kitchen and had a 3-hour Bible study. We just went through the Bible. I had never met anybody who knew the Bible in my life. I sat at his kitchen table. He had me to read the verse. He quoted it and explained it. From 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, I was blown away. I loved that, but I'd never known anybody.
And who was that minister, John?
Ben Adams. Do you know George Adams? George, they are Memphis guys. Ben is deceased. He died, I believe, around 99, somewhere. Matter of fact, he died preaching at a massive heart attack. He preached in Blytheville, Arkansas. Mm-hmm. When you came into Memphis, I think he only has one sister that's living, and she is probably at Klondike, if she's still living. She was living when you were in Memphis. He had a brother named John Adams who used to be an elder at Southside, but I think he was deceased when you came. But Ben Adams, he has a brother named George Adams who is in.
So were you searching at that time? You say you grew up in the Baptist church, and
I wasn't actively searching because I had kind of decided, once I get married. Matter of fact, I got married on July the 8th. I was baptized June 23rd. So in my mind, I was looking forward to, I'll get married, kind of get settled in a week or two, and then we'll start this salvation pursuit, church search. That was kind of what I had in mind. And so when the Bible study took place, when I left his house on my way home, I rehearsed what he had taught me. And I said to myself, everything that he taught me, I read. So if there's going to be any changing, it's going to have to be me, because I read everything he said. So I actually stopped at a payphone to call him to tell him that I wanted to be baptized that night. But that was the day before call waiting, and he had a teenage son that was on the phone, so I never could get through to him.
Yeah.
I got through to him the next day, which was June 23rd, 1978, and that's when I was baptized.
And what struck me is the fact you're going back to the days of payphones,
Absolutely. As a matter of fact,
Yeah.
I worked for the telephone company, but did not have a phone in my apartment.
Okay.
So, Exxon station at the intersection of Walnut Road, at the intersection of Highland and Union Avenue.
Yeah.
Up there to make a phone call, his line was busy. I lived beside a Channel 13 television station on Highland. So I went past my apartment, went to a bus station, and made a call from the payphone. His line was still busy. So I went on to my apartment, and then I called him the next day.
Let me ask, was the payphone call a quarter or a dime back then?
Dime,
Yeah.
We talked about 78.
Yeah. Hey, we're dating ourselves, man. I do remember those days of payphones, the pay booth, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Well, how long have you been preaching, and describe your call to ministry? We don't often use that in churches of Christ, but if we would really look back at ministry, we all came to ministry in a different way. So how long have you been preaching, and what was your call to ministry like?
One of the things that I've always done, if I'm going to be in it, I'm going to be in it. If I'm not going to be in it, I'm not going to be in it. So from day one, when I was baptized, I cut the plan of salvation off of the back of the church bulletin and put it in my wallet so I could tell people what to do to be saved and give them the scriptures. So from day one, I started talking to people about how to be saved. So the following year, my private ministry had just grown to public. So my public preaching was simply an outgrowth of my private teaching. So in 79, I was baptized June of 78. I believe it was April of 79, I preached my first sermon. Our preacher relocated back to Texas, and Ray Peterson became the preacher. So he gave me my first opportunities to preach. And in about 5 months, he gave me the opportunity to preach every fourth Sunday. So I had been in the church about a year and a half or less. I've been in the church about 15 months, and I was preaching every fourth Sunday. Matter of fact, I took my first church after I had been preaching. I'd been in the church 36 months. I was preaching for the church. I'd only been preaching 2 years. I started preaching for the Washington Street Church of Christ in Jonesboro, Arkansas. So I was brought along too fast, didn't make any major mistakes, but there were things that I did not know to take advantage of. I would not recommend putting someone in that responsibility that quickly without some close scrutiny. Now, Peterson and I both, we were working 40-hour-a-week jobs. So we were working 40 hours a week, and all we could do was put together a sermon.
Now you said Peterson. I think I know who you're talking about, but for the sake of the audience.
Yeah, Charles Ray Peterson, who preaches at South Park.
Right. Okay, good. Okay. All right.
And we started knocking doors. We would get off from work. I worked for the phone company. He worked at Plow. I got off at 4. He got off at 4:30. At 5 o'clock every day, we were walking the streets, setting up Bible studies. We started doing 2 Bible studies per evening, on Monday and Tuesday, and Thursday and Friday. And the church filled up. And I literally mean, we were having Sunday school classes in the hallway because we had no room for the classes. And so personal work rose a church. And that's how we did that.
You contributed to the book Somebody Must Come Preaching, which was a compilation of sermons from African American preachers. We didn't do every book in the Bible, but we covered the major divisions, and you wrote a special article for that, and I thank you for that. How would you describe your preaching? Is it expository? Is it narrative, topical, exegetical? I don't know if I'm missing out some of the categories, and I may not even have mentioned your particular gift to preaching, but because this is a podcast that deals with preaching, the first question is, how would you define your approach to preaching, your type of preaching?
Coming up in Memphis, and I think most preachers try to pattern themselves after a preacher that they perceive to be interesting or successful. So there were guys like Alfred Holmes, guys who came through. So I attempted to try and preach with what I call the racehorse style of preaching. But when I went to Jonesboro, Arkansas, we had 7 members and 7 people in the audience, and 4 of them was my family sometimes. And we got children, so you're preaching sometimes, and nobody's actually paying attention because the baby them are distracted. So I went to a teaching style rather than a preaching style. So I went to a teaching explanation because it's hard to get excited and do your triple runs when you're preaching to 7 people and they've been distracted. So I went to a teaching style then, and in 1983, well, actually in 81, I started taking some extension classes for Creed Hardeman, and I was introduced to expository preaching. So I attempted to do expository preaching, and I now suggest that if you don't do expository preaching, you ought to do expository study so that the points that you're going to make are consistent with the exposition of the text. Though you may present it topical, though you may present it textual. So I, most of the time, do not do expository preaching, but in the crafting of the sermon, I have done expository study. So my preaching is a teaching style. I like repetition. I like the audience to respond because I preach for behavior change. And most all of my sermons at the end, I'm going to call for a specific behavior from the people who hear. Because if we don't do something with the sermon that we heard, nothing gets better. So that's kind of describes my preaching style. And one of the things that I've learned, that if you are a teacher, you can go into anybody's pulpit. I don't care if he's a dynamic preacher. But if you are a preacher, it's a challenge for you to go into a teaching pulpit. So I had actually preached for years before anyone taught me how they put their sermons together. I listened to people and I thought, Okay, that's good to do that. That's not good to do that. As I said, I started preaching in 1979. I preached in Jonesboro, Arkansas. I preached for a church in Henderson, Tennessee. And then I was now preaching in Spring Lake, North Carolina. And Brother Nokomis Yeldale came up probably in 1986.
Mm.
And Clifford Davis came down to hear him. And Clifford Davis said to Brother Yeldale that night when church was over, he said, "Son, so you have come a long way." He said, "I remember when you used to read your sermons." Brother Yeldale and I went out to eat that night. I looked at him and said, "You used to read your sermons?" He said, "Absolutely." He said, "As a matter of fact, he had to keep his finger on his manuscript so he wouldn't lose his place. So he never could write on the bulletin board." And I said, "Well, how did you get to where you could preach without notes?" And he said to me, "You know your sermon, you just don't believe it." So the following Sunday, I started preaching without notes. And for years, preached and didn't even carry a note into the pulpit. But he shared with me how he put his sermons together. I did preach a couple of sermons like that, which is an excellent way. It will help a person to remember their message, a very powerful way. But I didn't continue to do it that way.
So Brother Yeldale had a lot to do with your delivery as far as preaching without notes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, I used to have a lot of throat trouble. He taught me breathing techniques. He told me to stand up with my back up against the wall, breathe from the diaphragm. He taught me how to illustrate sermons, how to use a physical illustration, and all of that.
Yeah.
He's the only preacher that has ever shared with me how he put his sermons together.
That's interesting because, he and I worked together for 6 years before he passed. And I remember some of those morning conversations he and I would have in his office. And I asked him about his preaching and preaching without notes. And he said he actually wrote his sermon out. He wrote it out word for word. And then his daughter, one of his daughters, when they were home, I suppose, would actually type it for him. But when he got in that pulpit, he was so eloquent.
Absolutely.
Without notes. I mean, from beginning to the end. I mean, and he would have you on the edge of your seat with his eloquence and his content. Tell us how you prepare for your sermon. So now, your style is more teaching, but before you get to the pulpit, what is your sermon preparation like?
When I was in North Carolina, I would locate the text from which I was going to preach, and most of my preaching then was expository. I preached from a section of scripture. And the first thing I would do is I would look up the root of every word in those verses. And then I would work with that word until I got a practical definition for it. And then I would look at what's repeated, how are these verses outlined. And so much of my preaching, major points, would always come from the text. So I would get the major points from the text, and then I would find a word or phrase to communicate it that would help people to remember it. And so then when I was at Freed Hardeman, I heard about a guy named Harry Emerson Fosdick, one of those great reformers, and he preached 2-point sermons. That fascinated me. So I went to the library and looked up his sermons. Never preached any of his sermons, but the idea of a 2-point sermon. So 95% of the sermons that I preach are 2 points. There are 2 points with 2 subpoints.
Yeah. Yeah.
Helps me remember it. And then I do contrast. I do rhyme, or I do word ending similarity. And then when I was in North Carolina, I ran across a book entitled Preaching Sermons to Meet People's Needs by Bryson, I believe, Harold Bryson, I believe. I know the last name is two men, Bryson and Taylor. That book is out of print, but you can find it somewhere. I think it might be a little ridiculous price. But that book revolutionized my preaching. And it shows you how to take a biblical text and get all of your main points from that text, and then how to unveil that text and preach that text in such a way as you are calling for an action. So the idea of Harrison Emerson Foster preaching 2-point sermons and Bryson and Taylor, that book, that revolutionized my preaching and gave me a comfort level so that when I preach, I have a high level of assurance that I'm preaching what the biblical text is trying to communicate. So,
Do you remember your first sermon, the first sermon you ever preached?
you know, I do somewhat. Don't remember the title. It was recorded, and some years later, I misplaced it. I really wish I had kept it. Matter of fact, it was interesting. In Memphis, back in the day, when a guy wanted to preach, a group of men would come out on Monday night and let you preach your first sermon. And then after you preach several sermons and they thought you'd made a little progress, they would then let you move up to Wednesday night instead of the Bible class. Now, and then after you preach there for a good long while, then you would move up to Sunday night.
Yeah.
Well, they started me out on Wednesday night. That was my first sermon was on Wednesday night. So the whole church was there. And people came up to me afterward and said, man, don't tell me nothing. This is not your first sermon. So people did not believe that that was my first sermon. And I think about 2 months later, I preached the second sermon. The only thing that I remember, I had been in a barber shop somewhere and I saw a rhyming poem. I can't remember what it was. And I ended my sermon with that.
Yeah.
It just got great.
Well, you know, it's something as I think back to when I got started and some of the other podcast interviews we've done. Everybody had that Wednesday night experience. You know, you get the Wednesday night experience, then the Sunday night, but you feel like you made it if you get a chance to speak Sunday morning. You know, so Sunday morning is like the highlight of everything. You've mentioned several places that you've preached, and it seems like you have taken on the challenge of starting churches. I heard Jonesboro, Arkansas, of course, Anderson, and but what advice would you give to someone just getting started in ministry? You know, someone, I want to be a preacher. I feel like the Lord has called me to preaching, or and you mentioned Brian C. Jones was just a good personal worker, and now he's senior minister of Newburgh Church in Louisville. But what advice have you given to someone, or what advice would you give to someone who is interested in ministry?
I think every preacher, not just starting out, but I think every preacher needs a coach, and every church needs a coach. I think every preacher needs to be close to some preacher to where, because of your immaturity, you may actually think you see something, but you are close enough to senior wisdom so that if they give you some advice to the contrary, you are willing to take that, even though you think differently. I think too many preachers have short circuited their ministry because they thought they saw something that they should do or shouldn't do because of their inexperience. And they went forward with it. And then when it blew up, it couldn't be put back together. So I've had preachers like Frank McElveen, Walter Vance, and to some degree, Brother Brown, Brother Yeldell, Brother Kennedy, that's Brother Joe Brown, Harold Red. Those were guys that if I saw something, that even if it was something that I saw in the text, I would run it by them. And if I could not make a compelling argument, I wouldn't preach that until I was convinced that I'm right and they're not right, especially if it is something that does not have to be said or done. And so I think every preacher needs to do that. And then every preacher needs to understand that you do not preach everything that you learn in your study. Your sermon is not a referendum to get out there everything that you learned in your study. And so those are some things that I think are crucial for a young preacher. I've had the preachers that I've just mentioned.
Yeah.
All of them have suggested something to me that I have asked them about, and they saw it differently, and I decided not to do it.
Mm.
I decided to wait and prepare it better before I did it. Now, I had done a number of things that older preachers said that would not work. God has blessed me for it to work, but because they said that, that made me uncover all of the stones so that it would work.
Right, right.
I mean, man, Joe Brown, man, he has poured into me.
Yeah.
How to write. If you have conflict, write what people said. Meeting.
Yeah.
Sitting out in the room. And what clothes they had on so that the story changes.
Yeah, yeah.
And that sauce, that has saved my life.
Yeah.
I had a person that was not telling the truth, and we found inconsistencies in her story against her husband.
Yeah.
So we kept changing. And
well, you mentioned some names, and that was one of the questions I was going to ask about other preachers who have poured into you. And I heard Joe Brown, the late Joe Brown from Richmond, Virginia. I heard Nokomis Yeldale, and of course, but Yeldale rubbed off on a number of people. Both of them have departed. I think I heard you mention James Kennedy as well.
James Kennedy.
Yeah, and they're deceased, but Harold Red is still living. Are there any other preacher? And you mentioned Brian C. Jones, a younger preacher. Any other preachers who've made a significant impact on your ministry?
Humphrey Fouts. What's this brother name? He died in Cleveland. Big guy. Remind me of Humphrey. Came from Kansas City.
Buford Shields.
Buford Shields.
Buford Shields was a preacher. I mean, I came behind Buford Shields in Kansas City. And you know, I'm always coming behind one of these great preachers, and that's a hard act to follow. But Buford could flat out preach. Yeah.
Lord Harris. I heard N.L. Evans.
Yeah.
Lord Harris preached a sermon in 1980, and I could preach about half of that sermon right now.
Yeah.
Johnny Lawrence, oh my goodness, man, I learned so many. And not only about preaching, but about people management.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, Clyde Muse,
Yeah.
I became very close and to them. Now, I got in trouble with my contemporaries because I decided years ago I need a preacher who comes to do something for me. I need a preacher who not only preaches to the church, but I need a preacher that pours into me. So I need a preacher that has some success. So for years, I never invited a preacher unless he had been preaching where he is for 15 years and he has grown a church to at least 300. Now, my contemporaries used to criticize me very harshly. They thought I was trying to get on the big time circuit.
Mm.
I said to them, I have 35 members. You got 37. Man, you can't help me. So when I brought a guy, Matthew Moore, when
Yeah.
I brought a guy in to preach for me all day long, Dallas Walker,
Yeah.
Cecil, all day long, I picked his brain.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Breakfast, I picked his brain. When we went to lunch, I picked his brain. After church at night, we always went out to eat.
Yeah.
David Jones, I picked his
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
didn't open my mouth except to ask questions.
Yeah.
Once you get 50, though, you need to you need to reach back and start impacting the younger generation. So, excuse me, in my earlier days, I was looking for people that could invest in me. Now I'm looking for people that I can invest in them. So
Right.
it is flipped.
Yeah.
I coached the Eagle Creek Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. Been coaching them now for 13 months. And they are just a tremendously progressive church, looking for some other churches to coach. Because I believe that every church needs a coach. Uh, Selling real estate, I noticed the top salesman in my office in the past 10 years, actually the past 15 years, has averaged selling $2 million of real estate per month. Now, 3% commission, that's pretty good money. But he hires a coach. He pays $400 a month for a 20-minute coaching session. People would say to him, man, why do you do that? You're at the top of it. He said, that's how I stay there.
Mm.
So I think that once preachers get to the point where we are over the stigma of asking for help, and then we can begin to take advantage of the wisdom and expertise of other people. Now, back in the day, Brother Holt, Brother Winston, Brother Hogan, they just kind of came in, and Brother Lawton and Billy and Wells and Jack, they came in and coached you whether you asked for it or not. Jack talked, not Jack, but Billy talked about going somewhere, and the people didn't want them there. So we stopped doing that. Preachers stopped. Really help, and
Yeah.
a lot of mistakes.
Well, let's close out on this one, Brother Marshall. I want to thank you for taking time out to share. You've deposited some jewels on today, but I always close out. What's the current state of the church in your opinion? Now, when I ask this question, we know biblically Christ is the head of the church, and we also know that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. But when we read the letters, especially the epistles of Paul, churches are not perfect and won't be perfect until Jesus comes and takes the saved with him. And the Apostle Paul had to deal with, had to address some issues. So, what is the current state of the church at this juncture, in your opinion?
I think when we look biblically, the church has always had issues. So I think we have to prepare ourselves to continually engage with people who see the biblical text differently. And we might need to make a commitment that we will not argue that every time we get together, but maybe 2 or 3 times a year, we need to have a discussion on that. And then we learn to tolerate the deficient theology while we are trying to help people to grow beyond that. I remember several years ago, Billy made a statement, I believe it was in the CHRIST-HOPEWELL, that after 45 years or 55 years of preaching, he had gained some insights into the operation of the Holy Spirit. Well, my suspicion is that 30 years earlier, he would have cut a guy up for preaching what he now sees. And so I think that, and I actually talked to him about that. Matter of fact, I addressed that in one of the books that I wrote, and I told him before I put it in the book that I was going to address that. And I sent him my manuscript, not that I needed his approval, but I wanted him to see what I was going to say before I said it, so that he would know that I'm not taking a pot shot at him. Now, he never responded, but I did send it to him because I just thought that demands integrity. And I think that if a person is going to push back on something that a person says, even if they say it publicly, I think a private conversation can carry a great deal of weight, because I think that human jealousy will sometimes not allow us to accept correction publicly, but privately we might accept it. So I think if we do that, we increase the probability of getting a person to see it. So I think the state of the church, we are in transition. And I think we need to think in terms of right-sizing our theology in this sense. When we discover that the Bible does not definitively demand this, we must be willing to say, though this is my preference, I would love to encourage people to do that for uniformity, but we cannot castigate a person if a person doesn't see, doesn't choose to use their liberty the way another person chooses to use it. I do think, and I've been asking for this for years, we need to have some conferences where there are people on both sides of issues presenting their position paper and discuss it, not emotionally, but logically and rationally, getting into the biblical text. And
But when you say church in transition, in what ways do you see the church in transition? How?
I think there's a number of things that have been traditionally promoted that a very, very small percentage of the church adheres to that. I think back in the day, there were things that people subscribed to and practiced. They didn't believe it. I think one of the things that has caused a great deal of turmoil, there are a number of preachers who will say to you privately, well, this is my private, but I won't say it publicly. Well, now that sounds good, looks good on the surface, but what you're doing is presenting yourself as a pure hypocrite. Because when you say, this is my private position, but I won't say it publicly, and then you get up and preach publicly what you just got through telling a preacher you don't believe, he has no choice but to place you in the category of being a hypocrite. So I think that a lot of our young preachers have concluded that older preachers did not believe some of the things that they were preaching.
I think I'm going to try to have a platform where we address that, because what one believes privately may not be accurate, and that might be why they keep it to themselves. But you know, you mentioned earlier about the uniformity piece, and then I was talking to another preacher, and he talked about the expediency piece. There are some things that we don't say due to expediency, but I agree with you. I think we do need a platform where positions can be presented, and sometimes it's better to put on paper rather than and then publicly to discuss. Um, because when you put it on paper, you have time to prepare, have time to maybe research and that kind of thing. So I think those days are coming. I think those days are coming.
I,
Uh,
Fortunately, I think we waited a little late. I think we've alienated guys who are perceived to be the brighter minds. I used to tell Brother Moose 25 years ago that we needed to do this, and never could get him to agree to do that. I told him we needed to do that in the national lectureship. We might need to restrict those discussions to preachers and elders. I don't think the rank and file members need to be a part of it. So I think that we have alienated a large segment, and I think they are unwilling to listen. And I think some of the guys could have been retrieved, or they would have been restricted and not gone out as far as they did if we had done that. I am optimistic. Uh, I'm not quite as optimistic because I don't see any venue whereby people are doing that. I don't see that in motion.
yeah.
I had a conversation with Billy probably 9, 10 years ago, and I offered to him. Matter of fact, it was before Barclay hosted the lectureship in Atlanta the first time. And I said to him, I believe it was the 75th or one of those milestone lectureships. I said, it's a shame that we do not publish a book from the lectureship. I said, what we could do in the book is to publish doctrinal teachings from guys that may not speak on the lectureship. So I had that telephone conversation with Billy. He thought it was a good idea. He said to me he was going to have Brother Wells to call me, but I never heard anything from him. So I offered Barclay and Orphis an opportunity to publish a book. They declined. I offered Penn an opportunity. He declined. I offered Burnell Holly an opportunity to produce the book. And I promised them that I would produce the book at zero cost on my end. I won't do that now. But I wanted to show them how they could publish a book and finance the lectureship.
Yeah.
But that was not. And I think that a book, so you have some guys are writers, some guys are speakers. So we could take a book and then open up to 12, 14 other preachers who submit manuscripts. So we would give breath to our lectureship, and they would get a chance to do some doctrinal, good foundational stuff.
Well, I think the day is coming when something similar is going to happen like that. Bro Marshall, I want to thank you for giving me your time and sharing these thoughts. And I'm going to close out now with this podcast. And we're praying that your wife feels better and continue to do the good work that you're doing in Anderson, South Carolina.
Can I say one thing? If you go to my website, johndavismarshall.com, and you can sign up for a free digital copy of the magazine Matters, and you'll get a digital copy in your email every month at no cost.
All right. Thank you, sir.
You and the work you're doing, my brother. Be encouraged.
All right. Appreciate you.
All right.
Well, I want to thank you for watching and listening. This is going to be on 2 platforms, the anchor.fm podcast, Somebody Must Come Preaching, and also, that'll be an audio version. And then the audio and video version will be on Somebody Must Come Preaching and the Facebook page. And we had a little technical difficulty. The Wi-Fi kept going out. So sometimes I think you saw that the screen froze. But we thank John Davis Marshall ministering in Anderson, South Carolina, for sharing with us on today. May God bless you. May he bless you real good.